Communism. Where did it come from? Are you a communist? Are my neighbors communists? Early 1900s. Fade in on a sleepy Russian shtetl. Communism is born. It becomes the official government of choice in Russia, or as they now insist on being called, the Soviet Union.
Oh.
Meanwhile, across the Pacific, democracy, the arch nemesis of communism, keeps a wary Freemason eye on the Soviets from the safety of its fortress, the United States. Our heroes walk in, Buck Rogers and Duck Dodgers.
Of the 21st and a half century?
But ideas are sneaky and hard to trace, so organizations were formed within the United States to try to keep an eye on things within its own borders.
Oh, you know who's not going to like that is America.
The earliest of these started in 1918 to keep an eye not only on people with communist sympathies in the United States, but also on a more urgently worrisome ideology at the time, fascism. Locally, an organization we talked about very briefly once, the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, was formed in July 1936 as a voice to let people know that some of the people working in Hollywood, the Jews, saw what was going on in Germany and also in the United States, and they didn't like what they saw. By 1938, this group had around 5,000 members, with people like Dorothy Parker, Fritz Lang, Oscar Hammerstein, Dashiell Hammett, Ernst Lubitsch, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Chico Marx, no, none of the other Marxes, except for one Marx. Carl, the fifth Marx brother, even worse, that's Zeppo, Benny Goodman, and Eddie Cantor. We're going to be naming, there's going to be a lot of...
You've already named a lot of names, and I like some of those people. I do not like what you're doing.
No, these are good guys. They don't like Nazis. Oh, wait, no, you love Nazis.
Oh, my God. I drive a Ford swastika.
So these guys, the anti-Nazi, we are going to be naming a lot of names. Yeah. But we're naming them all. I'm naming good and bad. Yeah. That people have to know. Yeah. And they're all bad.
And they're all dead, too.
Most of them. Kirk Douglas is still around. Is he? Have we been Weekend at Bernied?
We will leave a memorial at the end of this podcast, so when he does die, that you will think that this entire time we were aware.
And Green Day's Time of Your Life will be playing. And it'll only be clips of him when he's old.
It's amazing that song's still a song, you know?
It's a good song.
Okay.
It's punk. They used to be sort of punk, but they really went punk with that song.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot sell it to little kids, you know what I mean? Mature
This
only.
isn't your grandma's punk. So these guys, the Anti-Nazi League, they had rallies at the Shrine Auditorium. Oh. Tellingly, for the future, the only studio heads with the guts to be in an organization like this were the Warner Brothers. Unfortunately, another organization popped up May 26, 1938, the Dies Committee. It might be D's. I'm going to say it's Dies. For the purpose of this, it's Dies.
German. It sounds very German, though.
The Dies Committee. Yeah. Headed by a Democrat from Texas named Martin Dies Jr.
Is that a verb? Are you saying a sentence?
Martin Dies Jr.
Comma Jr.
They were an official committee of the House of Representatives created to investigate subversive organizations, in particular suspected Nazis and KKK members. Only instead of KKK members, the committee decided to focus on the American Communist Party because they suspected them of meddling with the Works Progress Administration. This committee was a reincarnation of similar earlier committees like the McCormick-Dickstein Committee and the Fish Committee before that. So it goes Fish, Dick, Dies. Their biggest power was that they had the power to subpoena people to appear before the committee. Luckily, Dies knew precisely where to look. Hollywood, or Commiewood, as he might call it. I call it that. He didn't come up with that.
I want this Hollywood sign changed to that.
Commiewood land.
Commiewood land. Just keep making letters.
A place he's considered to be infested with communists.
Come on.
Infested is a strong word.
Yeah. Swarming.
Sure, we have a queen communist that we all produce honey for, but can you really call us infested? This wasn't the first time Hollywood had come under suspicion either. J. Edgar Hoover, the crossdresser, had once launched a big investigation into communism in Hollywood under Operation Compic, or Communist Infiltration Motion Picture Industry. But the Dies Committee got specific. They had names given to them by an ex-communist named John Leach.
Oh, the first name namer.
And in 1940, 42 names were printed as being under investigation. Ooh. Names like Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, and Katharine Hepburn. Dies himself came to LA and met with 12 of the accused at the Biltmore Hotel and cleared 4 of them and then decided all the rest were fine, but he still had suspicions about one guy, Lionel Stander. I don't know who that is.
I do.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I know Lionel Stander.
Keep an eye on Lionel Stander.
Okay, keep an eye.
Is he going to come up later?
Yeah, I have that thing on him.
Interesting. Wow, I foreshadowed you. The problem with this inquisition was that they had no facts or any proof at all to back up their accusations. This committee was not very popular because they were very anti-FDR at a time when most people liked FDR. So this attack on specific Hollywood stars was just seen as sort of a cheap publicity stunt by the committee to draw more attention to themselves because it was a guaranteed headline grabber, which maybe we should consider doing.
Yeah, definitely.
The committee also went after the Anti-Nazi League, calling it a communist front organization, and helped in their demise. People who were anti-fascist were looked down on up until the U.S. got into World War II, when it became official policy to be anti-fascist. Another shining moment for the Dies Committee was when Dies threatened in 1941 to subpoena all Japanese people in L.A., claiming that he had evidence of a plot against America by the Japanese fishermen living on Terminal Island, which I'm sure was a genuine concern, but just hearing that sentence is so ridiculous.
Yeah. What's your evidence? A hunch. Several hunches in a row.
All the peanut benders at Dodger Stadium are in a plot to kill FDR, and I know it.
They're going to use 2 Zeppelins.
This committee also had a hand in getting Japanese people sent to internment camps.
Jeez.
So once World War II really got going in America, though, the Dies Committee was mostly put on hold since the communists, who were once to be suspected, were now our greatest ally in the war effort, and we can't be, rounding them up. Why not? Let's round them up.
They could be our captors and our allies at the same time, for
We're
sure.
fighting a war with you by capturing you. Get in there with the Japanese. But that didn't stop another organization from taking aim at Hollywood for communist ties. The California Joint Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities was formed by Jack Tenney, basically to continue the work of the defunct Dies Committee, and held yet another round of investigations into communism in LA in October 1944. Jack Tenney's investigation was called Reds in Movies.
It's funny that they're blacklisting all these writers. They need a writer just to come up with some of the titles of this crap.
They're good old-fashioned American titles.
They're
straight and to the point.
Johnny's Home.
Rock Hudson. So nobody was cooperating with Reds in Movies, and that quickly, okay, I guess we've cried wolf. It's not happening this time. But then the war stopped, and suddenly the Soviet Union, our greatest ally, was now our greatest threat. So when the way the world was going to be once the war was over started becoming clear, in the dying days of the Reich, certain groups and individuals in America began to position themselves favorably for the New World Order, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Listen to it back, play it again.
New World Order.
New World Order. New World Order. Listen to it backwards and you'll hear the plans for a New World Order. One of these groups was the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, formed in 1944. Again, all these people could have used communist writers. These are not very catchy.
Yeah, they are not. I'm not signing up with that party.
Oh, the MPAPAPI? They were a very conservative group of showbiz people who were strongly anti-communist, which was the new official policy of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
They were founded by guys like King Vidor and Walt Disney. Amongst their around 1,500 members were Gary Cooper, Cecil B. DeMille, Victor Fleming, Ward Bond, Clark Gable, and Ronald Reagan, and their president was John Wayne. And vice president, a shotgun.
A shotgun in a rocking chair that won't stop rocking.
Call in the treasurer. It's a horse.
Horse dragging gunpowder.
Needless to say, this group was accused of being anti-labor, anti-women, anti-Semitic, and anti-black. Does that surprise you at all?
Not at one bit.
In opposition...
Ooh, comfy hoods.
They were the KKK without hoods.
They were not ashamed of it.
In opposition to the alliance were groups like the Free World Association with supporters, good guys like Orson Welles and James Cagney. I know I laughed through that. He was a weirdo, but I mean, he had good ideas.
All right.
He liked kiwis. And I'm not talking about New Zealanders.
I'm talking about the fruit that looks like testicles.
But one man's testicles in particular. Charles Foster Kane. That's what Rosebud was.
I get it now.
America is corrupt. But now that the war against communism was officially on, Big Daddy woke up and the Dies Committee was back in action. Only now that Republicans had taken control of Congress for the first time since the 30s, a temporary subcommittee of the committee was made permanent in January 1945 and took center stage. The House Committee of Un-American Activities, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC.
HUAC, as I'll call it. HUAC. A name come up with by Al Pacino.
He popped out into this world a little early just to go, HUAC! And then he came back.
First premature words.
It was HUAC's duty to investigate any disloyalty or communist ties in American citizens. And like I said, being a group with an ideology that was not very popular pre-war, now post-war, the rest of the country came around to their way of thinking. Yeah. And now HUAC decided they wanted their crack at Hollywood pinkos. But what put them back in their sights? Hollywood, that is. The Hollywood Blacklist is pretty much a fable with the moral of united we stand, divided we fall, played out in the crucible of Los Angeles, and this is the first example of that. It started with a very popular local trade paper, the Hollywood Reporter. Do you know this?
No, I didn't know this.
Settle in.
Oh, boy.
You might want to cancel your subscription now. I know you read it daily.
I need to know.
Who might be the young Han Solo? The man in charge of the Hollywood Reporter at the time was the man who founded the Hollywood Reporter, Billy Wilkerson. He was born in 1890 in Nashville and grew up to go to medical school in Philadelphia until his dad died and he inherited all of his gambling debt.
Okay. Is that true?
Yeah. Why would I make that up?
Because it sounds really funny.
No, it's true. People die. A dad couldn't die. No. His dad didn't die.
No.
So to make quick money, he quit medicine and started working with great foresight at a Nickelodeon in New Jersey. He began climbing up the ladder of the East Coast film industry until he was eventually in charge of distribution for Carl Laemmle's Universal Pictures.
Wow.
Then he started getting delusions of grandeur, and in 1927, he tried to start his own movie studio, but the others already had such a tight grip on the industry, he quickly found himself to be a failure.
That's better than slowly finding out you're a failure.
Yeah. His next big idea was to start a trade paper that was actually based in Hollywood, where all the action was now happening. So he moved there in 1929.
29? Oh, God, the year.
And in 1930, the Hollywood Reporter was open and reporting for Reporter. And then the Depression hit. To keep them afloat, Billy Wilkerson got involved in nightclubs, which sounds like a nursery rhyme. He got involved in nightclubs and alcohol and developed relationships with guys like Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, and Bugsy Siegel.
They love gambling debt.
Oh, yeah.
That's how they run their game.
We knew your father. As you can tell, they made it through the 30s, but Wilkerson also had friends like Howard Hughes, who introduced him to a friend of his named J. Edgar Hoover.
J. Edgar Hoover here.
Who seemed to have some sort of obsession with communists and dressing like a woman in Hollywood and started giving inside scoops on the situation to Billy Wilkerson. The reason why Wilkerson went through with what he decided to do next isn't entirely clear, but there are a lot of possibilities that might all be true because humans are complex and we illustrate that regularly, hence we are a good podcast. Leave us a review. Billy Wilkerson had an obsession with communism in Hollywood also, and starting in 1945, he had been writing anti-communist articles in his paper against what he called the Red Beachhead.
No, all right. I thought that was a drink.
He was also anti-Screenwriters Guild. The Screenwriters Guild didn't like how the Hollywood Reporter wouldn't cover a story unless the studio bought ad space in their paper. So the guild banned all of its members from buying ad space in the Hollywood Reporter in protest. Billy Wilkerson responded by not listing screenwriting credits with those of directors and actors in a movie review. This is just my theory. This might be why writers today don't get as much credit as actors and directors do.
That could be true.
Thank you, Billy Wilkerson. But now, with Hoover on his side, Billy Wilkerson had actual names to go with his communist accusations. He knew the gravity of what publishing these names meant. He knew publishing them would damage many lives, and that in doing so, it meant he could potentially alienate himself from the industry and lose everything that he had worked for. Some think that he wanted to do it just to get a good story. Some think he was being pressured to do it from his mafia affiliations. Some think that he was just going along with the political rhetoric that was being yelled around at the time. Some think he wanted to do it to get in good with the studio heads. Some think he wanted to do it to get revenge at the studio heads for boxing him out of having his own studio. Something he was afraid that if people in Hollywood started coming out as sympathetic to communism, it would turn off audiences and Hollywood as a whole would suffer and collapse, and he wanted to nip that in the bud. Something he just plain genuinely disliked communism and he felt that it was his moral duty. Billy Wilkerson was a very religious man, and religion is an enemy of communism.
Yes.
Supposedly, he went to his priest with his dilemma and asked if he should go through with it, and the priest told him, "Get those bastards, Billy." So on July 29th, 1946, the Hollywood Reporter published an article called "A Vote for Joe Stalin" that named 11 Hollywood employees as communist sympathizers, and the fire was ablaze once again, as red as what they're fighting against. HUAC was now bringing down the hammer full force on Hollywood. What the Hollywood Reporter did is an embarrassment to the industry, and they did lose a lot of readers. They also gained a lot of readers. They continued to cover the story almost every day for the duration of what became known as the Inquisition in Eden. But once it was over, they didn't talk about it for years out of shame. They didn't issue a formal apology until 2012, when Wilkerson's son finally was like, sorry, you shouldn't have done that.
He inherited his dad's moral debt.
You can't go to the mafia for that one. So now, HUAC was headed by a very conservative Republican from New Jersey named J. Parnell Thomas. This is pre-Joseph McCarthy.
Yeah.
But even when he was involved with HUAC, he had nothing to do with what happened in Hollywood. So Joseph McCarthy, go listen to your McCarthy podcast or whatever you want. He has nothing to do with
the hell of that.
A man who was a member of the Hollywood HUAC committee was renowned non-crook Richard Nixon. HUAC alleged that communists had infiltrated mass popular culture and were putting pro-communist messages into their content to brainwash the public.
Trojan horse that stuff in.
Hey, what are you, some sort of Greek sympathist?
Oh yeah, what are you gonna come over here and tell me a bunch of little tales, huh? How to get
past the Cyclops? some sort of nymphs? How you gonna fight off a nymph? I don't know about that. Maybe I don't want to fight off a nymph.
Maybe I want to sleep with all the sirens.
Their idea of brainwashing the public, this included portraying the U.S. in a negative light in movies that they knew would be shown internationally. Here's one. They also claimed that they had been sending coded messages in movies, alerting communists in Europe during the war about the locations of American air raids on Germany so that they would know to stay away or to take cover. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah. That's really...
They give them way too much credit. Yeah. Communists are not that organized.
These guys are pole vaulters because they are making a giant leap.
For mankind. Emboldened by the articles of the Hollywood Reporter and courted by the John Wayne-led Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, HUAC secured $75,000 in funding and set up shop at the Biltmore Hotel again in Los Angeles to continue their investigation in May 1947. And on September 21st, 41 people were subpoenaed to appear in front of Congress in Washington, D.C. Now let's take a step back. Were there actually communists in Hollywood?
You want me to ask that? Were there actually communists in Hollywood?
I plead the fifth.
Guilty!
The answer is yes. Communism is a political party and isn't inherently affiliated with Stalinism, just like how Islam is a religion and isn't inherently affiliated with ISIS. Not to say Stalinists and ISIS are similar, but they're both organizations that tarnish the good name of something that is not malicious or to be afraid of. But much like how many people today don't really think that way, HUAC was also confusing the two. They also didn't have much evidence to support their claims. Most movie studios at the time weren't interested in putting out any movies with any sort of message or meaning in them. Sam Goldwyn said, if you want to send a message, use Western Union.
It's a good writer.
One example they cited was the movie Mission to Moscow that was made in 1943, which Jack Warner was told to make by the Roosevelt administration to change people's minds about staying out of the war by showing Russia in a positive light and showing American isolationism in a negative light. HUAC saw this as a communist fair.
Yeah.
Other pieces of evidence were Russian words being used in movies. What HUAC was really against, though, was liberalism and social change. Say what you will about those borscht-guzzling Reds. Communism has some good ideas.
Yes.
Oh no.
Oh God.
God, I hear the helicopter.
They're here for us.
Communist police. You two aren't supporting socialism, are you?
No, it's something else.
Well, all right, comrades. So some of these good ideas, workers' unions, social security, these are communist concepts that our democracy has adopted and is better for. The guy who wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a movie that epitomizes the American spirit, Sidney Buckman wrote that, was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Hollywood being a pretty liberal town, a lot of the people working in show business weren't so much gulag KGB commies as just social rights advocates.
Yes.
That being said, it was understandable also that people were afraid. Stalin was real, spies were real, and the Soviet Union was a powerful country with powerful weapons, not least to them being an ideology. Hollywood studios were based on clearly defined hierarchies, and the equality of communism was something people in the higher up positions feared. But the way they went about addressing this fear is absolutely deplorable.
It was an embarrassing time in our country.
Oh, it's horrible. Yep. I love it. So back to September 21st, 1947, 41 people are subpoenaed, 22 friendly witnesses and 19 unfriendly witnesses.
Yes.
The hearing started October 20th, 1947 with the friendly witnesses. These were people they didn't suspect of being communists, but knew could be counted on to provide information. Many in this group of 22 were members of the always willing to please HUAC Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Walt Disney testified, so did Ronald Reagan, Louis B. Mayer, Gary Cooper, Sam Wood named names, names and warned to keep an eye on writers. Ayn Rand didn't name names but fully cooperated with all their other questions. The friendlies were allowed to read prepared statements, and Jack Warner said, Jack Warner, my how you have turned. Ideological termites have burrowed into many American industries, organizations, and societies. Wherever they may be, I say let us dig them out and get rid of them. My brothers and I will be happy to subscribe generously to a pest removal fund.
Oh.
Then it was time for the unfriendlies. Of the 19, 11 were to testify, and they saw that nobody in Washington was on their side, so they wanted some moral support from back home.
Yeah.
And they did have support back home. On October 29th, a week into the hearings, Variety put out an ad saying how disgusted and outraged they were at what was happening and asked, who's un-American? And then underneath that, 116 names of people who had the courage to put their John Hancock on this declaration.
Oh, wow.
People like Leonard Bernstein, Katharine Hepburn, Henry Fonda, Arthur Miller, Gregory Peck, Otto Preminger, and then kind of nullifying the list for reasons you'll hear later, Bud Schulberg and Elia Kazan.
Yeah.
Before the subpoenas even started, there had been a rally on May 19th, 1947 at Gilmore Stadium against HUAC with Henry Wallace in attendance and Katharine Hepburn reading a speech written by Dalton Trumbo that said, silence the artist and you silence the most articulate voice the people have. Answering the call for support, though, were members of the Committee for the First Amendment.
Yeah.
This was an organization formed by John Huston, William Wyler, and Philip Dunn to protect the right to exercise the First Amendment and be able to freely believe in whatever you want. Their first meeting was at Ira Gershwin's house and grew to include members like Charles Boyer, Joseph Cotton, Joan Crawford, Van Johnson, Spencer Tracy, Gene Kelly, Frank Sinatra, Vincent Price, Lauren Bacall, and Humphrey Bogart. These
were just parties. Like, why are they going to dress it up? They're just partying.
They were the craziest of parties. They weren't just parties. And I'm not talking about the Communist Party. This group had bought national radio time, and on October 26th, they broadcast Hollywood Fights Back! Exclamation point.
That's the title.
It was a half-hour anti-HUAC plea for the investigations to end, starring people like Judy Garland saying things like, we don't mind being called bad actors, but we resent being called bad Americans. And boy, were they called bad actors. Groucho Marx pretended to be J. Parnell Thomas.
That's funny.
After the program, the committee sent a delegation of 26 to Washington, headed by Bogart and Bacall, armed with a petition signed by some 80 celebrities, with Bogart saying things like, I am an outraged and angry citizen who feels that my basic civil liberties are being taken away from me. On November 2nd, they had a part 2 of the show with Danny Kaye, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Rita Hayworth, and Peter Lorre, but by then it was already too late. The day after the first program, on October 27th, the hearing of the 11 unfriendlies began. Here's who those 11 were. I'm going to give you their names. I'm going to name all the names.
You're going to name the names?
Don't worry, I'm naming names. And a little bit about what they did. Alva Bessie, a screenwriter whose career was just getting started and who also fought the Nazis in the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
Herbert J. Bieberman, a writer and director who wasn't particularly well known. That's all I have to say about him. Bertolt Brecht, who's a very famous German writer. Great. Lester Cole, he wrote a few Charlie Chan movies, and he wrote The Invisible Man Returns, and was instrumental in getting the Screenwriters Guild going again. He was also an official member of the Communist Party.
Don't tell anyone.
Cut that part out.
Nixon.
Edward Dmytryk, a director of such movies as Raymond Chandler's Murder, My Sweet and Crossfire. He also helped define the film noir genre. He was also a member of the Communist Party and will come back later to haunt us. Ring Lardner Jr., a member of the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League and Academy Award-winning writer. He was also a member of the Communist Party. John Howard Lawson, the first president of the Screenwriters Guild and writer of movies like Blockade and Sahara. Albert Maltz, an O. Henry Award-winning writer who also wrote Pride of the Marines and is an uncredited writer on Casablanca. He was also a member of the Communist Party.
Don't tell anyone.
Keep that a secret. He was a pro-American writing hero during World War II and was immediately after made a villain. Samuel Ornitz, a screenwriter and founder of the Screenwriters Guild. Adrian Scott, a producer who also helped define the film noir genre. He was also a defining member of the Communist Party. And lastly, the most famous behind probably Brecht is Dalton Trumbo. We'll get more into him later. He was one of the highest paid writers in Hollywood at the time, and he was a member of the Communist Party. So the trial of these 11 began, and from the start, it was clear that this was not going to be a fair fight. To start, they insisted on addressing all of the Jewish people involved in this group by their original Jewish names, not their business names.
Right.
Unlike the friendly witnesses, these 11 were not allowed to read prepared speeches. They were instead brought before the committee and asked the infamous question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Only one of these men actually answered the question. Brecht said no. no. The rest refused the very idea of the question and claimed protection under the First Amendment. Being screenwriters, they insisted on reading prepared speeches anyway, but they didn't get very far. Alva Bessie managed to get in.
It's my third draft.
I mailed this to myself, so you can't steal this. This is copyrighted.
I brought Lawrence Olivier to read it for me.
Imagine this. Imagine it's not me. Imagine you're talking to some hunky man, the straightest man there is, Rock Hudson, and he's playing with this other guy, Liberace. You'll find out who he is.
Just in glitter and a weird haircut.
You'll find out what glitter is when your kids grow up. So Alva Bessie managed to get in. I will never aid or abet such a committee in its patent attempt to foster the sort of intimidation and terror that is the inevitable precursor of a fascist regime before he was escorted out of the building.
Okay, well.
Trumbo was dragged out yelling things like, "This is the beginning of the American concentration camp." After they asked Lardner the question, he responded, "I could answer the question exactly the way you want it, but if I did, I would hate myself in the morning."
That's funny.
Lawson was asked the question. I assume he sighed and then responded, "It is unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of America." And then the gavel banging started, but he kept going, and J. Parnell Thomas banged his gavel 16 times, supposedly breaking it, as Lawson was escorted out yelling, "Hitler's Germany, Hitler's tactics."
What year was this? 47?
47.
Hitler's dead for 2 years. That's hitting close to home.
Yeah. The hearings were closed after Brecht, who fled back to Germany the next day and never returned.
Wow, really? I didn't know that.
Leaving just the unfriendly 10, or as we now know them, the Hollywood 10.
Yeah.
One for each amendment in the Bill of Rights.
Look at that.
Congress was not charmed by their antics, and on November 24th, 1947, they voted 346 to 17 to charge them for contempt of Congress.
Yep, fun, baby.
They were convicted in early 1948 and each fined $1,000. Bieberman and Dmytryk got 6 months, but the rest were sentenced to a year in federal prison. They appealed the sentence in June 1949 and lost, and then took it to the Supreme Court. But in April 1950, the Supreme Court decided not to hear their case. This meant that anyone else accused of being a communist or whatever else they decided to accuse you of, that you could no longer claim protection under the First Amendment of the Constitution, because that does not work here. But the thing is, HUAC didn't have the power to create a legal blacklist. The Hollywood Blacklist, as we know it, was imposed on Hollywood by Hollywood itself.
Yeah, it was an unofficial punishment.
Yeah, unofficial.
I mean,
I'm going to give you an unofficial punishment for speaking up against me. Hollywood, they talked a big game and were ready to make a stand when the subpoenas happened, but when the public saw how the 10 looked in the hearings, it really was not favorable to them. They came off as unnecessarily mean and sometimes even crazy. But I mean, what's crazy about getting dragged out of a building yelling about Hitler?
Screaming until a gavel breaks.
If that's crazy, give me a Napoleon hat. Get the giant butterfly net and strap a jacket on me. You know, Hollywood is nothing without the public on its side.
Yeah.
So show business started to backtrack on their words. The day after the verdict was reached on the 10, November 25th, 1947, the president of the Motion Picture Association of America, Eric Johnston, who, when this whole mess started, declared, "As long as I live, there will never be a blacklist in Hollywood," and that he would never be party to anything as un-American as a blacklist. He called a meeting with 48 movie executives at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The studio heads, ever shrewd, were afraid of what the public turning on them might do to the film industry, so they issued what is now known as the Waldorf Statement, where they vowed in regarding to the 10, "We will forthwith discharge or suspend without compensation those in our employ, and we will not re-employ any of the 10 until such time as he is acquitted or has purged himself of contempt and declares under oath he is not a communist, and that no communist or other subversives will be employed by Hollywood." Ooh. And the blacklist was on. Set your phasers to black.
Any other subversives is really scary because their reach is so, anything.
Oh, what? You don't like movies about cowboys?
You didn't eat all
subversive.
That hot dog.
What are you, subversive? These 10 no longer had jobs and were not welcome back into Hollywood, and that went as a warning for anyone else caught being a communist. But it didn't stop there. A few days after this statement, Bogart and Bacall started to back away. Yep. They claimed they didn't fully understand the situation and didn't know those guys actually were communists and had been, quote, duped.
Bogey. Come on.
Of all the gin joints in all of Soviet Russia, you had to back out of this one. And with those two silenced, no other big stars stood up against any of this for another 10 years. Even Edward G. Robinson Even Edward G. Robinson, who had been paying all the legal expenses of the 10, eventually caved in and named names himself. By February 25th, 1948, the whole committee for the First Amendment was disbanded. The guilds fully cooperated with the blacklist because they were afraid of making the rest of their members look bad if they didn't. So they thought they were protecting, their own people. The Screen Actors Guild was being run by Reagan, and he was real strict on enforcing the blacklist. The only one who seemed to be against it was Sam Goldwyn. But, what's one man? But Sam Goldwyn. One person can't stop something like this. It took the cooperation of the entire industry to pull this off, and they let it happen by staying silent and keeping their heads down while their friends' lives were ruined. But it didn't end there. HUOC put out yearly reports on who they suspected were communists, which contributed to what many people refer to as the Gray List, which was a list of people not officially forbidden to work in Hollywood, but understood that you shouldn't hire this person. Then in 1949, eager to please, the American Legion gave a list of 100 people they had evidence as being communist that they circulated to the studios, and then came Big Daddy. There was a right-wing magazine called Counterattack that was the newsletter of facts to combat communism. This was started by some former FBI agents, and on June 22nd, 1950, they published Red Channels, the report of communism influence in radio and television, which listed 151 names of supposed communists and their CV, Communist Vitae. This became the Bible of the Gray List and called out people like Lloyd Bridges, Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Arthur Miller, Orson Welles, Langston Hughes, Dorothy Parker, Gypsy Rose Lee, Leonard Bernstein, Elmer Bernstein, Burgess Meredith, Pete Seeger, Dashiell Hammett, Burl Ives, Charlie Chaplin, Luis Buñuel, and Zero Mostel, and many, many more.
I think one of the most famous things at Red Channels is it ended the career of a woman named Marsha Hunt, who had just started her career. And she wasn't even, never at any point, communist, she was just a Hollywood liberal, but the day she found out, she was at dinner or at lunch with Eleanor Roosevelt. And she's like, well, and that was it. That was the end of her career.
Oh, check, please.
I gotta be going.
Put this on the presidential tab. The whole business of Red Channels and how they got their information was really shady, and the sorts of things that would get you in Red Channels were speaking at a teachers union meeting, or supporting African famine relief programs, or attending world peace conferences, and they listed all of the things that you did. What they didn't list were all of the anti-communist organizations you may have been a part of also. Some people were even mixed up for other people and were listed incorrectly. Their careers were still ruined. Like, oh, you're McCartney? I meant McCartney. Sorry. Sorry, Paul. No Beatles this decade. Speaking of Beatles, Ed Sullivan loved Red Channels.
Really?
He
seems like
every night before bed. Read it.
Daddy, will you read me the thing again?
Pete Seeger. He one time gave a quarter to a homeless man. Commie. Charlie Chaplin once wore a red tie to a dinner. Commie. Almost 60% of all the people being accused were writers. The whole thing just descended into Mad Max.
It's so sensational.
Who was a commie.
Yeah.
People
sharing a truck. Commie.
Drinking gasoline for water. Commie. People were accusing other people just to settle old scores or for personal advancements. Careers were being ruined left and right. Accused people got hate mail. They got death threats. Friendships were ended. Marriages ended. Some people fled the country. It was like a little mini lead up to a Holocaust. That's what was happening. People were being targeted and punished for exercising their rights of free speech and freedom of beliefs. As one guy who later testified and named 7 names said he never forgave himself, but he was commended by Reagan and the movie executives. He said, when a man performs an act of personal betrayal of his friends, he's regarded as a 100% all-American patriot. And then round 2 started.
Oh, yes.